In the golden light of stained glass windows, the church stood tall, a monument of hope, faith, and sanctuary. For centuries, its towering cathedrals and solemn rituals represented purity, divine order, and moral authority. Behind those sacred walls, whispers were forbidden. Doubt was sin, and silence was holiness. But not everything sacred is safe. Throughout history, men of the cloth were revered beyond question, guardians of the soul, trusted without hesitation. Parents left but behind the white collar and the confessional screen, something darker often hid. Something few dared to imagine, and even fewer dared to speak about. The abuse didn't start in the 20th century. It didn't begin with headlines or documentaries. There are records, as early as the Middle Ages, of complaints made by parishioners against priests. The oldest known case dates back to the 11th century, when a French bishop was quietly relocated after several altar boys came forward. Their stories were dismissed as heresy. In 1622, a papal document warned of unspeakable sins among the clergy, but nothing changed. For the Church, protecting its image often meant protecting its predators. Instead of punishment, abusers were reassigned. From one town to another, one country to the next. The crimes disappeared into silence, the victims into shadows. The system wasn't built to protect the innocent, it was built to protect power. As centuries passed, so did thousands of children through the same doors, through the same rituals, under the same lies. What was meant to be sacred became, for many, a lifelong source of pain. In this video, we will walk through the forgotten corridors of truth. From ancient cover-ups to modern outrage, from confessions sealed by fear to the unmasking of monsters in robes. Because faith should never be a shield for violence. And the truth, no matter how long buried, always demands to be heard. Fade to black. For centuries, the Church held more than spiritual authority. It held influence over kings, ruled over lands, and shaped the fate of empires. But its greatest strength lay not in gold or armies. It was in the trust of the people. Trust so deep that questioning a priest was once seen as questioning God himself. This sacred trust created a silence so heavy, it drowned the cries of those who suffered behind the church doors. In medieval Europe, the clergy were not merely spiritual leaders. They were judges, landlords, educators, and healers. Their power reached into every corner of life. And with this power came a shield that protected them from scrutiny. When early reports of abuse emerged in monasteries and parishes, they were often dismissed as lies or temptations. Children were told they had misunderstood. Families were advised to stay quiet. Speaking out meant disgrace, exile, or even excommunication, and so many chose silence. Inside the cloisters and abbeys, whispers grew. Confessions were heard, but not of sin, of trauma. The Church had developed intricate systems to investigate itself, but often those systems favored secrecy. When a priest was accused, he might be quietly moved to another town. No warning was given to the new parish, no justice was offered to the victim. The word scandal wasn't used. Instead, the Church called it internal matters or pastoral concerns. This language softened the horror. It reframed crimes as personal struggles, and because the Church controlled the narrative, the world believed it. Documents from the Vatican archives show that as early as the 17th century, abuse cases were systematically hidden. Instructions were sent in Latin, warning bishops to keep such matters under the seal of pontifical secrecy. This wasn't just about protecting the innocent from public shame. It was about preserving the image of the institution. That image of pure, divine, and touchable became more important than the truth. And so, decade after decade, century after century, the Church turned inward. It protected its own. And those who suffered were left with silence, fear, and unanswered prayers. But not all remained silent forever. The veil would not stay in place forever. Beneath the surface, resistance began to grow. For decades, survivors of clerical abuse whispered their truths into silence. But at the dawn of the 21st century, in a city known for its devout Catholic population, something began to shift. In Boston, Massachusetts, a team of journalists at the Boston Globe would pull at a single thread. And what unraveled was a global reckoning. It began quietly. A few survivors stepped forward, cautiously. One of them was Patrick, a grown man haunted by memories from the 1970s. He spoke of a local priest who had groomed and abused him and other altar boys. The pain in his voice wasn't just from the abuse, it was from the years of being ignored. From the sense that the church had protected his abuser. The Globe Spotlight team, an investigative unit with a history of tackling corruption, started to dig. They weren't prepared for what they found: dozens of priests, hundreds of victims. And most shocking of all, evidence that church officials had known. That they had reassigned priests instead of reporting them, that they had quietly paid. As the team uncovered sealed documents and fought legal battles for access, they discovered names, files, letters, internal memos from the Archdiocese of Boston that spoke not in empathy, but in strategy about how to minimize damage, avoid scandal, protect the church. Cardinal Bernard Law, the Archbishop of Boston, had for years reassigned known abusers to new parishes. He offered apologies, but no justice. And when the story broke in 2002, it shook not only Boston, but the entire Catholic world. Survivors began speaking out in cities around the world. From Ireland to Chile, from Poland to the Philippines, the stories began to echo. And the silence that had once protected the institution cracked wide open. The Boston scandal marked a shift. For the first time, the church could no longer hide behind tradition and ritual. Journalists, survivors, and advocates forced the world to confront a truth many had long suspected, but few dared to name. The weight of centuries of silence had begun to lift, but the cost was immense. Lives broken, faith shattered, trust destroyed. Still, it was a beginning. The Boston revelations were not an isolated storm. They were a spark, one that ignited a global fire. In Ireland, the Catholic Church had long been considered the beating heart of the nation. It shaped families, schools, even governments. But after Boston, the Irish media began to listen more closely to the quiet voices that had always been there. Whispers of abuse, of cover-ups, of pain buried under decades of devotion. Then came the Ryan Report, a staggering, 1,000-page document published in 2009. It detailed decades of systemic abuse within Irish institutions run by the Church. Children beaten, molested, starved, shamed. Survivors spoke of reformatories and schools that were more like prisons. The Magdalen laundries, once hidden in plain sight, were revealed to be places of forced labor, cruelty, and silence. The world looked on in horror, but Ireland was only the beginning. In Poland, the homeland of Pope John Paul II, reports began to surface in the 2010s. Survivors came forward despite a culture of deep-rooted respect for clergy. One documentary, Tell No One, released in 2019, caused a national shockwave. It showed priests admitting to abuse, often still protected by diocesan authorities. The Church's power in Poland was strong, but the people were beginning to demand answers. Germany faced its own reckoning. Over 3,000 cases were identified in a 2018 Church Commission study. Many dated back decades. The report showed that most offenders faced no consequences. That files were altered, shredded, or kept in locked archives. That bishops had known and failed to act. And in Latin America, the stories came pouring in. In Chile, Juan Carlos Cruz, a brave survivor, stood up against Fernando Caradima, a powerful priest with ties to the Vatican. For years, his words were dismissed. But in 2018, after a public outcry, Pope Francis was forced to apologize. Bishops in Chile resigned en masse. From Australia to France, from Mexico to Canada, the pattern was eerily familiar. The abuse was widespread, the cover-ups were methodical, and the cost in human lives, in broken families, in lost faith, was immeasurable. These were not random acts of individual evil. They were systemic, enabled by silence, protected by institutions, hidden by those sworn to protect the innocent. By the end of the 2010s, it was clear the Church was no longer untouchable. Survivors were no longer silent, and the world was no longer willing to look the other way. But justice was still painfully out of reach. The Vatican, the heart of Catholicism, a symbol of holiness, power, and eternal tradition. For centuries, it has stood not only as a spiritual beacon but also as one of the most secretive institutions on earth. Within its marble halls and golden chapels lies a complex web of rituals, politics, and silence, a silence that, for many years, concealed the most disturbing truths. As the first waves of scandal began shaking local dioceses in the late 20th century, many looked to the Vatican for leadership. But what the world witnessed instead was something far more chilling: deliberate inaction, obscured records, and a bureaucratic fortress determined to protect itself rather than the innocent. Documents later revealed that internal memos had circulated in the Vatican as early as the 1960s, alerting high-ranking officials, even popes, to mounting allegations of abuse in dioceses around the world. But rather than discipline or defect known predators, many were simply relocated. Often, the Vatican invoked pontifical secrecy, a canon law directive that barred bishops from reporting abuse cases to civil authorities. In other words, the Church's law was placed above state law. One of the most notable moments of global outrage came in 2010, when Pope Benedict XVI was accused of having failed to act on credible allegations against notorious priests while serving in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Despite mounting pressure, internal investigations rarely led to public accountability. A chilling case is that of Marcial Maciel, the Mexican priest who founded the Legionaries of Christ. Accused by dozens of victims over decades, including allegations of abusing his own children, Maciel was protected by powerful cardinals and even praised by Pope John Paul II for his effective ministry. The Vatican only sanctioned him shortly before his death in 2008 without ever publicly acknowledging the full extent of his crimes. What became increasingly evident was that the Vatican's primary concern wasn't justice, but reputation. The Church feared that acknowledging systemic abuse would damage its moral authority, its claim to divine guidance. In the rare cases where internal action was taken, it was almost always private. Trials were held in secret, verdicts sealed, and perpetrators quietly retired. Survivors were often silenced through financial settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. Meanwhile, the message from the top remained consistent: protect the Church at all costs. This wall of silence wasn't just built with ignorance. It was reinforced with intent, brick by brick, memo by memo, transfer by transfer. And so, while local priests and bishops bore the visible shame, the true machinery of denial rested in the heart of Rome. It was the Vatican that designed the response strategy, shaped the narrative, and ensured that, for as long as possible, the most damning stories never saw the light of day. But cracks had begun to form. Investigative journalists, survivors, and whistleblowers had started pushing back. And the wall, it was beginning to crumble. The stories have been told. The names have been spoken. The walls of secrecy that once insulated the Church have begun to crack. But what remains after the trials, after the headlines, after the apologies is something that cannot be undone. For every survivor who found the strength to speak, there are many more who never could. The trauma of abuse doesn't end when justice is served. It lingers, invisible, passed on through silence, broken trust, and the lifelong effort to reclaim one's dignity. Institutions like the Catholic Church were built to last centuries, and for many, they represent not only faith, but identity, family, and tradition. That's what made the betrayal so profound. It wasn't just the abuse, it was the denial, the lies, the slow, deliberate erosion of accountability in favor of protecting reputations and power. In recent years, the Vatican has made gestures toward transparency. Pope Francis acknowledged the culture of cover-up, commissions were formed, guidelines were published, some bishops resigned, some priests were laicized, but for many survivors, these acts came too late and often fell too shallow. Because the core issue remains the power imbalance between clergy and laity. The reverence that protects abusers, the bureaucracy that still resists full exposure, and the faithful who are torn between their devotion and their disgust. In the end, this is not just a story about priests who committed crimes. It is a story about a global institution that, for decades, even centuries, chose silence over justice. It's about what happens when power becomes untouchable, when suffering is denied, when forgiveness is weaponized to erase consequences. And yet, despite all this, change has begun. Survivors have built networks of support. Journalists continue to investigate. Courts are less afraid to challenge the Church's influence. The once unquestioned authority of religious institutions is now subject to the same scrutiny as any other power. But perhaps the most meaningful change is this: people are listening. And in listening, we honor not just the pain, but the resilience. Not just the history, but the hope that it will never be repeated. The Church, in many places, remains a source of comfort and community, but it can no longer pretend innocence. It must confront its past not with platitudes, but with action, not with prayers, but with protection for the most vulnerable. Because in the end, faith should never be a shield for abuse. And belief should never demand silence. This is not just a reckoning. It is a reminder that institutions fail, but truth endures. That justice may come late, but it matters. That even in darkness, voices rise. And for every survivor whose story was ignored, disbelieved, or erased, this is for you. You were right to speak, and the world is finally listening.